I was not born a monster. I was not hungry for blood. I did not dream of death. I dreamed of justice. In a quiet room, long before the crowd screamed my name, I believed something dangerous. That a man could be pure, that a nation could be virtuous, that evil could be cut away cleanly, like rot from a fruit. They will later call me the incorruptible. They will whisper my name with fear. They will reduce me to a blade, a scaffold, a number. But before the guillotine, before the terror, before the silence that followed my fall, I was only a man who believed too much. This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about certainty, about what happens when morality refuses to bend, about how virtue, when it stands alone, can become more merciless than vice. Tonight, you will not hear history shouted. You will hear it breathe. You will walk beside Maximilien Robespierre through dim corridors, crowded assemblies, sleepless nights, and finally to the edge, where conviction becomes destruction. Before we begin, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? And what hour has the world reached where you are? Settle in. This story is long, and once it begins, there is no clean way out. I do not remember warmth. People like to imagine childhood as something soft, something forgiving. Mine was precise, quiet, cold in a way that teaches you to listen. I was born into absence. My mother died when my voice had barely learned its own sound. My father, restless, ashamed, unfinished, disappeared soon after, leaving behind a name that felt heavier than love. So I grew up not held, but observed, by walls, by books, by silence. Arras was a careful town, stone houses that never leaned too close to one another, streets that obeyed straight lines, people who spoke politely, but never deeply. It suited me. I learned early that noise was dangerous. Emotion was imprecise, affection unreliable. But rules stayed. I remember the sound of my footsteps echoing alone on cold floors, the way my breath felt too loud in empty rooms. I learned to sit very still, to watch before I spoke, to weigh words as if each one carried consequence, because in my mind they did. While other boys played, I read, not for pleasure, for structure. Pages did not abandon you. Sentences did not lie, at least not openly. Law, morality, reason, they formed straight paths through a world that felt otherwise unfinished. Adults said I was serious. They meant it as praise. They did not see that seriousness was not a choice, it was a defense. There was no chaos in books, no sudden departures, no graves that appeared without warning, only logic, only cause and effect. At night, when the house settled into that deep, hollow quiet, I would lie awake and listen to the city breathe, not with fear, with calculation. If a world could be understood, then it could be corrected. I did not dream of power. I dreamed of order. I watched people carefully, how they bent rules when it suited them, how they excused cruelty with smiles, how injustice often wore the face of tradition. Even then, I felt something harden inside me, a certainty forming, slow and absolute. If goodness depended on convenience, then it was not goodness at all. If justice could be postponed, then it was already dead. I did not cry much. Tears felt wasteful. Instead, I learned to endure. Teachers noticed me not because I was loud, but because I never wavered. My answers were exact, my posture correct, my discipline unsettling. They rewarded me with opportunity, and so I left Arras, not escaping it, but carrying it inside me. its restraint, its severity, its quiet belief that order mattered more than comfort. I did not yet know how dangerous that belief could become, but the foundation was already laid, stone by stone, silence by silence. I was becoming someone who would one day believe that mercy was optional, and that righteousness, once defined, must be defended at any cost. At the time, I thought I was becoming good. I did not yet understand that goodness without tenderness does not remain goodness for long. And so my journey began, not with fire, not with rage, but with a calm, unwavering conviction that the world could be made clean, if one was willing to be strict enough. And I was praised for my restraint. They mistook silence for wisdom, obedience for virtue, discipline for maturity. I did not correct them. Inside me, something was already separating itself from other men. Not arrogance, no, something colder. A belief that feelings were obstacles, that hesitation was weakness dressed as kindness. I watched how adults compromised, how they softened rules to avoid discomfort, how justice bent when the offender was familiar, respectable, useful. I learned from this, too, not how to bend, but how not to. When I was sent away to study, I did not feel loss, only purpose. Paris was louder than Arras, more chaotic, more alive. And yet, beneath its noise, I sensed the same decay. Inequality masked as tradition, suffering justified as necessity. At the Lycée Louis le Grand, I was surrounded by sons of privilege. They laughed easily. They assumed the world belonged to them. I did not hate them. Hate is emotional. I judged them. They spoke of philosophy as entertainment. I treated it as instruction. Rousseau did not move me as poetry. He struck me as law. If men were born equal, then every inequality was a crime still in progress. If virtue was natural, then corruption was learned and therefore punishable. These ideas did not excite me. They settled into me like a verdict. I was not charismatic. I did not persuade with charm. I persuaded with certainty. People began to notice something unsettling about that. I did not seek approval. I did not soften truths to be liked. I did not laugh when laughter was expected. They said I lacked warmth. What they meant was that I lacked indulgence. I watched my peers prepare for comfortable lives. Appointments, connections, futures, padded by family names. I prepared for conflict. When I returned to Arras as a lawyer, the courtrooms smelled of old wood and older compromises. Justice there was polite, measured, selective. I found it intolerable. I defended the poor not out of compassion, but out of principle. Poverty was evidence of systemic failure, not personal weakness. Each case confirmed what I already knew. The law did not exist to protect the vulnerable. It existed to stabilize the powerful. And stability, I decided, was not the same as justice. I spoke plainly. I refused bribes. I rejected favors. That is when the name began to follow me. Incorruptible. They meant it as admiration. I accepted it as obligation. An incorruptible man cannot bend. He cannot forgive what should not be forgiven. He cannot hesitate when faced with wrong. Slowly, without ceremony, I stopped seeing individuals. I saw categories, citizens, enemies, principles violated or upheld. It felt cleaner that way. The world, I believed, did not need understanding. It needed correction. And correction, by its nature, is rarely gentle. I still slept alone, still spoke little, still trusted ideas more than people. I did not yet know that revolutions do not reward precision. They reward momentum. And momentum, once unleashed, does not stop to ask who deserves to be spared. But that was still ahead of me. At this stage, I was convinced of one thing only, that if justice was ever to be real, someone would have to be willing to stand unmoved, while others begged for flexibility. And I had already proven that I could stand very still for a very long time. The silence that shaped me in childhood was no longer empty. It had become resolve. I did not notice when resolve hardened into something else. There was no single moment, no dramatic turn, only a gradual narrowing of the world, as if possibilities were being quietly removed, one by one. I began to distrust anything that could not be defined. Affection, mercy, forgiveness. They were spoken of often, praised loudly, yet applied selectively, inconsistently, almost always in favor of those who already possessed too much. Principles, at least, did not discriminate. In the evenings, after court sessions ended and the city grew softer, I would walk alone through Arras. Lantern light, trembling against stone walls, voices fading behind shutters, the steady rhythm of my own steps keeping me company. I listened to myself think. I asked questions others avoided. If a law is unjust, is obedience a virtue? If suffering is widespread, is patience moral? If corruption is tolerated, does tolerance become complicity? Each question led me to the same answer. No, I did not enjoy conflict, but I did not fear it either. Fear, I had learned, comes from attachment, and I had trained myself to live without that burden. People around me still believed change came from persuasion, from moderation, from compromise. I began to understand that compromise was merely delayed violence, harm stretched thin to appear acceptable. Better, I thought, to confront injustice directly, cleanly, without apology. I wrote obsessively, speeches, essays, fragments of thought that circled the same core idea. That virtue was not a personal ornament, but a public duty. The individual mattered less than the principle. Always. This realization did not make me cruel. It made me calm. Calm enough to endure disapproval. Calm enough to stand alone. Calm enough to accept that righteousness is rarely loved. When news from Paris reached us, murmurs of unrest, dissatisfaction, ideas once whispered, now spoken openly, I did not feel surprise. I felt recognition. The air itself seemed to be tightening, as if history were drawing breath. The old order, bloated and unquestioned for so long, was finally being examined and found wanting. Others felt excitement or fear. I felt inevitability. When I was elected to represent Arras, there was no triumph in me, no pride, only a sense that a door had opened which could never again be closed. Paris awaited, not as a city, but as a crucible. I packed lightly, books, papers, convictions already sharpened by years of solitude. I did not know how many would fall. I did not imagine rivers of blood. But I knew this much. If the world was to be remade, it would not be done gently. And if others hesitated when the moment came, if they faltered, excused, delayed, then someone would have to remain unyielding. Someone would have to carry the burden of doing what was necessary, while others clung to what was comfortable. I had been preparing for that role my entire life, not consciously, not proudly, but completely. And so, as I left Arras behind, the quiet town that had taught me discipline and distance, I carried with me a certainty that had no room for doubt, that justice, once awakened, must never be allowed to fall asleep again. even if it demanded more than the world was willing to give. Even if it demanded me, I arrived in Paris without awe. Others spoke of it as a living creature, a city that swallowed men whole, that dazzled and devoured in equal measure. To me, it was simply louder evidence of everything I already knew. The streets were crowded, but the inequality was precise. Palaces rose with mathematical arrogance, while bodies slept in doorways, as if poverty were part of the architecture. I observed, always first, I observed. Paris did not offend me with its chaos. It offended me with its indifference. Here, suffering was not hidden. It was normalized, accepted, explained away with words like tradition, economy, inevitability. I heard laughter spill from salons, where men debated philosophy over wine, their theories floating untouched by the hunger outside their doors. I did not interrupt them. I took note. This was a city where ideas were plentiful and responsibility was scarce. I lived modestly, spoke sparingly, watched everything. In lecture halls and assemblies, voices rose and fell with enthusiasm, but few carried weight. They argued for reform, as if injustice were a misunderstanding that could be corrected politely. I knew better. Injustice, when permitted to endure, becomes structure, and structures do not apologize. They must be dismantled. At night, Paris did not sleep. It murmured, groaned, waited. I could feel something pressing beneath the surface. Not anger yet, but impatience. The kind that precedes rupture. I did not feel fear. I felt alignment. Everything in my life, the silence of Arras, the discipline of study, the refusal to bend, had prepared me for this convergence. I was no longer merely observing injustice. I was standing at its center. Still, I believed, perhaps naively, that reason would guide what came next. That virtue, clearly defined, would be enough to steer events. I did not yet understand that once the crowd awakens, it does not ask to be led gently. It demands certainty. It demands absolutes. And I was very good at absolutes. Standing there, amid the noise and contradiction of Paris, I felt the final thread of my former life loosen. The private man, the careful lawyer, the observer, they were already receding. Ahead of me lay something larger, louder, and far less forgiving. The revolution had not yet begun, but I was ready to give it a voice that would never hesitate. I did not know then that leaving Arras was the last gentle act of my life. Behind me remained a world where silence had shaped me, where discipline had replaced affection, where certainty had grown undisturbed by consequence. Ahead of me stood Paris, not yet aflame, not yet screaming, but already waiting. I stepped forward without ceremony, without nostalgia, without regret, because a man who believes absolutely does not look back, and I believed. That belief followed me into the city like a shadow, quiet, precise, and patient enough to wait for history to break. End of chapter 1. I did not enter the revolution with fire in my veins. I entered it with clarity. Others arrived driven by hunger, resentment, wounded pride. They shouted, demanded, accused. They wanted change the way a drowning man wants air. Desperately, blindly, I wanted it correct. The early days were filled with words. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand like nervous confessions. Speeches rose and collapsed upon themselves. Everyone spoke of liberty. Few agreed on what it required. I listened. And as I listened, I understood something fundamental. The revolution did not lack passion. It lacked discipline. Liberty, spoken without restraint, became indulgence. Equality, proclaimed without rigor, dissolved into envy. Fraternity, unguarded, collapsed under the weight of self-interest. Virtue, I realized, had been invited, but never enforced. I began to speak, not loudly, not theatrically. I spoke as one states facts that cannot be argued away, as one names a diagnosis. A republic, I said, cannot survive on enthusiasm alone. Freedom without moral obligation is merely another form of tyranny. This time, of the many over the few. Some listened uneasily, others bristled. They preferred hope to responsibility. I did not. In meetings that stretched into suffocating hours, I watched men bargain with principles as if they were currency. Compromise here, delay there, always in the name of stability. But stability built on injustice is simply violence postponed. I spoke against the death penalty at first, not out of mercy, but because the state had not yet earned the right to kill. That distinction mattered to me. Rights were not eternal. They were conditional. They depended on virtue, and virtue depended on vigilance. As the monarchy weakened and the old structures cracked, I felt no triumph, only urgency. A collapsing order leaves space, and empty space is dangerous. Into it rush ambition, fear, revenge. If left unguided, the revolution would devour itself. Long before it could redeem anyone, I began to see myself less as a participant and more as a custodian, not of people, of principles. The idea settled into me slowly, but once it did not leave. That the Republic must be protected, not from its enemies alone, but from its own moral exhaustion. Virtue could not be optional. It had to be demanded, enforced, if necessary. At night, when the city's noise thinned into restless murmurs, I questioned myself, not with doubt, but with rigor. If corruption is tolerated, who benefits? If mercy is extended indiscriminately, who exploits it? If the guilty are spared for the sake of harmony, what lesson does that teach the innocent? Each answer pointed in the same direction. A republic that wishes to endure must be more demanding than the monarchy it replaces, more severe, more honest, less forgiving. This did not feel cruel to me. It felt responsible. Others still spoke of happiness, as if a nation could be pleased into justice. I spoke of duty, and slowly, quietly, the center of gravity shifted. People began to repeat my words, to adopt my definitions, to look to me not for comfort, but for certainty. They did not yet fear me. They trusted me, and that, I would learn too late, was far more dangerous. Because once a people entrusts its conscience to a single voice, it no longer hears the sound of its own limits. And I, who had never learned to bend, was about to be given the authority to decide where bending must end. I did not seek leadership. That is what I told myself. In truth, leadership gathered around me the way iron gathers filings, quietly, inevitably, without asking permission. The clubs filled with voices sharpened by anger and expectation. Men who had never been heard before now shouted as if volume itself were justice. They wanted enemies named. They wanted lines drawn. They wanted reassurance that their suffering meant something. They did not want nuance. Nuance is exhausting in times of hunger. I watched how easily fear disguised itself as virtue, how quickly resentment learned the language of morality. I understood the danger of that instinct, and yet I understood its usefulness as well. If the people demanded certainty, then certainty must be given to them, before someone less scrupulous provided it first. I spoke again more often now, not to inflame, but to define. Words like citizen, traitor, virtue, enemy of the people, they began to harden under my care, their meanings narrowing, sharpening, becoming tools. I told myself this was necessary. That clarity would prevent chaos. That a clean vocabulary would lead to clean outcomes. The applause came reluctantly at first, then with expectation, then with dependence. I noticed the shift before anyone else did. When I spoke, others fell silent, not in disagreement, but in deference. It unsettled me, not because I doubted my ideas, but because I saw how easily conviction could replace thought. I warned them earnestly that virtue was not obedience, that the Republic required vigilance even against those who claimed to defend it. They nodded, then waited for me to continue. I had become, against my own discipline, a measure, and measures are dangerous things when they stop being questioned. Still, the threats were real. The king hesitated. The court conspired. Foreign powers circled like patient predators, smelling weakness beneath the rhetoric of liberty. Every delay cost lives. Every compromise widened the fracture. I felt time compressing. Decisions that once allowed contemplation now demanded immediacy. History was accelerating, and it would not slow for doubt. I argued that the revolution could not survive while carrying the symbols of its own oppression, that mercy toward tyranny was cruelty toward the future. Some called this extremism. I called it consistency. A republic, I insisted, cannot be half-born. It must either emerge fully formed or be strangled by what it replaces. As debates turned harsher, friendships dissolved into factions. Men I once respected learned to bargain with principles they had sworn were sacred. I watched them carefully, not with anger, with assessment. Loyalty, I realized, was not measured by affection, but by alignment with virtue as defined by necessity. That definition, my definition, grew heavier with each passing week. I did not notice when my nights became shorter, my handwriting tighter, my tolerance thinner. Sleep felt indulgent, rest irresponsible. The revolution did not pause. Neither could I. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether my path was too severe, and began asking only whether it was severe enough. This question did not disturb me. It reassured me, because doubt, I had learned, is a luxury enjoyed only when consequences belong to someone else, and the consequences now were unmistakably mine. I told myself, again and again, that I was not pursuing power. I was assuming burden, that if I stepped aside, the vacuum would be filled by men who mistook ambition for vision and bloodlust for courage. Better, then, that the blade of justice, if it must exist, be held by a steady hand. I believed my hand was steady. I believed my heart was clean. I believed that virtue, once armed, would know where to stop. I did not yet understand that once morality learns to command, it no longer remembers how to listen. And the revolution, which had begun as an argument, was slowly, inexorably, becoming a sentence. Still, I moved forward, because to hesitate now would mean admitting that the silence which shaped me, the discipline I worshipped, the certainty I cultivated, might lead not to salvation, but to something the Republic would one day be forced to survive. I felt the shift before it was named. Revolutions do not announce their turning points. They reveal them in tone, in how questions are asked, in how dissent is received, in how silence becomes suspicious. The halls grew louder, but the space for disagreement narrowed. Where once arguments collided, now they aligned or were corrected. I watched men glance sideways before speaking, measuring the room instead of the truth. I noted who hesitated, who softened their language, who wrapped fear in the vocabulary of caution. Caution, I decided, was becoming a threat. The Republic was fragile. Everyone said so. Yet few seemed willing to accept. What fragility demanded? Protection, not symbolic, not rhetorical, active. I began to argue that neutrality was a myth, that in times like these, there were only those who defended the revolution, and those who endangered it, intentionally or not. This idea disturbed some. It relieved many more. Ambiguity exhausts people. Clarity, even harsh clarity, comforts them. I provided clarity. Committees multiplied. Lists formed quietly at first. Names spoken in low voices, written down and set aside for later. Later arrived quickly. Arrests were debated as precautions. Detentions described as temporary. Measures framed as regrettable necessities. I listened to the justifications and recognized my own logic. Coming back to me, simplified, sharpened, no longer asking permission. This should have unsettled me. Instead, I corrected the framing. If we speak of necessity, I said, then we must also speak of responsibility. If we act, we must own the moral weight of action, not hide it behind euphemism. Virtue must be honest. The room fell silent. They expected restraint from me, a reminder of limits, a pause. I gave them coherence instead. If the Republic is attacked, it has the right to defend itself. If enemies hide behind citizenship, citizenship must not shield them. If fear spreads, it must be answered, not indulged. The applause that followed was not thunderous. It was worse. It was resolved. I walked home that night through streets that no longer felt restless, but watchful. Windows glowed like unblinking eyes. Conversations stopped as I passed. I told myself this was respect. At home, I read until dawn, not to learn, but to reinforce. I returned again and again to the same principle, that morality without force is merely opinion, that the state, if it claims virtue, must be willing to act as its instrument. I did not imagine mass death. I imagined precision. A surgeon does not hate disease. He removes it. That metaphor comforted me. I began to speak of enemies not as people, but as conditions. Corruption, conspiracy, decay. Conditions do not plead. They do not deserve patience. They are treated. I still believed sincerely that once the crisis passed, severity would recede, that vigilance would relax, that the blade would be set aside. I believed this because I needed to, because to accept the alternative would mean confronting a truth I was not yet ready to face, that power, once justified by virtue, does not relinquish itself willingly, and that a man who defines righteousness cannot easily recognize the moment. He becomes its most dangerous interpreter. But that reckoning still lay ahead. For now, the Republic demanded firmness. The people demanded assurance. History demanded speed. And I, who had never learned the language of retreat, answered each demand with the same unyielding reply: proceed. Even as the air thickened, even as mercy grew quiet, even as the revolution, step by careful step, learned to speak in my voice. I began to feel watched by my own words. They followed me into every chamber, echoed back from mouths I had not taught, used with a confidence that suggested inevitability. The revolution no longer asked what should be done. It asked how far. And when distance becomes the only variable, restraint appears less like wisdom and more like betrayal. The committees worked relentlessly now. Papers moved faster than thought. Signatures multiplied. Names blurred into categories. I read each list carefully, not to savor them, never that, but to ensure consistency. Inconsistency, I believed, was cruelty disguised as compassion. If one enemy is punished and another spared for convenience, justice becomes arbitrary, and arbitrariness is the first step toward tyranny. I would not allow that. I spoke often of transparency, of moral clarity, of the heavy burden borne by those who must decide when others hesitate. People repeated those phrases with reverence, some with fear. I noticed how easily fear learned discipline. There were moments brief, unwelcome, when a name lingered in my mind after I set the paper down. A man I had heard speak once, a woman whose letter was written with trembling restraint, a face glimpsed in a crowd, pale with expectation. I dismissed these moments quickly. Sentiment clouds judgment. Judgment is all that stands between order and collapse. I reminded myself that the revolution was not a stage for personal conscience. It was a mechanism, and mechanisms function only when parts are replaced, without regret. Sleep abandoned me almost entirely. When I did rest, it was shallow, crowded with fragments of speeches, unfinished arguments, the sensation of falling without motion. I woke each morning not refreshed, but resolved. There was no room now for inner debate. The outer world was already too loud. Some began to whisper that the revolution was becoming something else, that it had lost its soul, that fear had replaced hope. I answered them calmly. Hope, I said, is not a policy. Safety is not a sentiment. A republic survives not because it feels righteous, but because it acts righteously, even when action is painful. Pain, after all, is temporary. Corruption is not. They did not argue further. I took their silence as understanding. The executions began to feel routine, not emotionally, procedurally. Schedules, logistics, efficiency. The city adjusted with terrifying speed. Markets reopened. Children played. Life continued. This reassured me more than it should have. If society could absorb such measures and continue, then perhaps they were not excess. Perhaps they were necessary corrections. I told myself this repeatedly, that the blade was not an instrument of vengeance, but of hygiene. That history would see what I saw, a man standing between chaos and survival. Yet even as I spoke these truths aloud, another awareness pressed quietly at the edges of my certainty. That I was no longer reacting to danger, I was anticipating it, punishing not only what was, but what might be. This awareness did not stop me, it sharpened me, because hesitation, now, would undo everything already done. I had crossed too many thresholds to retreat. To question would be to unravel, and unraveling in a revolution is fatal. So I pressed forward, with clean language, with steady voice, with principles polished until they cut. I told myself one last time that when peace returned, I would loosen my grip. That severity was a season, not a destiny. I believed this because I needed to believe it, because the alternative, that the revolution had learned to breathe through me, that its violence had found not just a justification, but a custodian, was a truth too large, too final, to be admitted, while the blade was still warm, and the crowd still listening for my next word. The crowd began to change before I did. Their faces, once tight with hunger and expectation, grew expectant in another way, quieter, more obedient. They no longer argued with outcomes. They waited for them. This unsettled me more than open resistance ever could. A people who argues is alive. A people who waits is preparing to surrender its judgment. I told myself that this, too, was temporary. That fear was a natural reaction to instability. That once the Republic was secure, confidence would return. But security, I was learning, is never satisfied. Each enemy removed revealed another. Each threat neutralized exposed a deeper anxiety, less visible, less definable, and therefore more dangerous. The language hardened accordingly. We no longer spoke of opposition. We spoke of contagion, of rot, of moral sickness. I approved this shift. Metaphor shapes behavior, and behavior, in turn, shapes outcomes. When men are framed as adversaries, they can be debated. When framed as disease, they must be eliminated. I did not invent this logic. I recognized it. And recognition, I believed, was better than denial. Some nights, alone at my desk, I paused longer than usual before signing. The ink waited. The room held its breath. I asked myself, not emotionally, but methodically, whether the Republic truly required this next step. The answer, almost always, was yes, because to spare one conspirator is to encourage 10 more, because to hesitate publicly is to invite doubt, and doubt, once seeded, multiplies faster than fear. I had become responsible, not just for decisions, but for momentum. Momentum cannot be guided gently. It must be directed firmly, or it will crush indiscriminately. I chose direction. Those who opposed me began to frame their resistance as concern for humanity, for moderation, for the soul of the revolution. I listened patiently. Then I asked them a single question. Which soul, exactly, should we save first? The starving, the conscripted, the betrayed, or the traitors who hide behind appeals to mercy while the Republic bleeds? They had no answer that satisfied necessity. So I moved forward without them. I told myself that history does not belong to those who feel deeply, but to those who act decisively. That compassion, when misplaced, becomes complicity. That a leader who falters does not preserve life. He prolongs suffering. These beliefs did not torment me. They organized me. I no longer thought in days or weeks, but in phases, escalations, thresholds. The revolution was no longer something happening around me. It was something passing through me. I felt this most clearly when voices rose against me, and I felt briefly nothing. No anger, no fear, only calculation. Opposition, I concluded, was no longer ideological. It was functional. Did it strengthen the Republic or weaken it? That was the only question left. I answered it without hesitation, and in doing so, I crossed a line that cannot be crossed halfway. From that moment on, I was no longer merely enforcing virtue. I was defining it. And when virtue becomes singular, when it speaks with one voice and listens to none, it ceases to be a guide. It becomes a command. Still, I did not stop, because to stop would mean facing the full weight of what had already been done, and I had never been taught how to live with regret. So I continued, with precision, with restraint, as I understood it, with a calm so complete, it bordered on silence, the silence of a man who has finally aligned his beliefs with his power and no longer knows which one is leading the other. I began to understand that fear was no longer accidental, it was being learned. People adjusted their language around me, their posture, their pauses, the way they framed agreement as loyalty, and silence as safety. They were not coerced. They were adapting. That realization disturbed me more than resistance ever had, because adaptation implies acceptance, and acceptance, once given, cannot be reclaimed without cost. I told myself this was evidence of effectiveness, that the Republic was stabilizing, that discipline was taking root, yet something essential was thinning, not loudly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Laughter grew rare in public spaces. Conversations shortened. Faces learned neutrality. The revolution had stopped being discussed. It was being managed, and I was managing it. I still spoke of virtue constantly, but I noticed how little I spoke of joy, how rarely I referenced the lives we claimed to protect. Instead, I spoke of survival, of endurance, of the future that demanded sacrifice. Always tomorrow, always later. I no longer framed severity as temporary. I framed it as proportional, proportional to threat, proportional to danger, proportional to the fragility of the Republic. The problem was that fragility never decreased. It expanded to match every measure taken to defend it. Each execution justified the next. Each silence confirmed the necessity of more silence. This should have signaled excess. I interpreted it as vigilance. There were moments rare, unwelcome, when I sensed the crowd no longer distinguished between justice and fear. They did not cheer because they understood. They cheered because order had returned. Order at any cost. That phrase echoed in my mind long after I first rejected it. I had once believed that virtue required education. Now I saw that obedience was faster, and speed in a revolution is seductive. I told myself that once the enemies were gone, speech would soften. That fear would loosen its grip. But enemies were no longer external. They were internal, conceptual, invisible. Doubt, hesitation, sympathy. I began to treat these as threats, not because they opposed me, but because they slowed the machine that now carried the Republic forward. I was no longer asking, is this right? I was asking, can we afford not to? That shift was subtle. It felt logical. It felt mature. It did not feel like corruption. It felt like responsibility evolving. And that is how I know now that this was the true turning point. Not the first execution, not the crowds, not the blade, but the moment I accepted that virtue could be measured by efficiency, that lives could be weighed against outcomes, that moral hesitation was a liability. We were still calling it a republic, but something else was forming inside it, something disciplined, unquestioned, and increasingly intolerant of delay. And I, who had once feared indulgence more than cruelty, had become the axis around which that new force turned. There comes a moment not marked by blood or applause, when a man realizes he is no longer choosing his path, only maintaining it. I had crossed that moment quietly, What began as vigilance had become necessity. What began as necessity had hardened into routine. And routine, once established, no longer asks why. I told myself I was protecting the future, but I no longer remembered the faces for whom that future was meant. I spoke of virtue daily, yet lived surrounded by fear. I spoke of the people, yet rarely heard their voices, unfiltered. Still, I did not stop, because stopping would have meant acknowledging that the republic I was defending no longer breathed on its own. It breathed through me. And I, who had built my life on silence and certainty, had become something far more dangerous than a tyrant. A man who believed there was no alternative. I did not intend to rule. I intended to guard. That distinction mattered to me, or at least it once did. The Republic of Virtue was not declared with banners or celebration. It emerged through language, through repetition, through the quiet consensus that formed when fear and righteousness began to speak the same dialect. We said that liberty must be defended. We said that equality must be protected. We said that the people must be saved, even from themselves. These statements were not controversial. They were comforting. What comforted no one was the implication beneath them. That virtue, left unregulated, was too fragile to survive. So we regulated it. Not openly at first. We framed it as guidance, as moral alignment, as the necessary consolidation of principles. A republic, I argued, cannot function if its citizens do not share a moral foundation, and morality, if it is to be shared, must be enforced. This was not tyranny, this was coherence. Laws multiplied, but their spirit narrowed. Speech was permitted, provided it strengthened the republic. Belief was tolerated, provided it did not undermine unity. Freedom remained, in theory. In practice, it was conditional. I watched this happen without alarm, because conditions are not cages. When you believe, they are justified. The committee became more than administrative. It became interpretive. We did not merely apply law, we explained reality. Who was dangerous? What constituted betrayal? Which intentions mattered and which excuses no longer did? The line between action and thought began to thin. I supported this, because thoughts become actions, and waiting for action is how republics die. Citizens began to speak less of rights and more of loyalty, less of justice and more of safety. They asked not, "Is this fair?" but "Is this necessary?" I taught them to ask that question. The guillotine did not dominate my thoughts then. It was simply present, a solution already accepted by the logic of events. What occupied my mind was purity, not personal purity. I had long abandoned that illusion, but collective purity. A nation, I believed, must be unified in purpose, or it will fracture under pressure. And unity cannot survive contradiction. Contradiction breeds hesitation. Hesitation invites collapse. So contradiction was labeled dangerous, not immoral. Dangerous. That word did the work of many arguments. I no longer saw disagreement as discourse. I saw it as delay, as erosion, as a slow leak in a vessel already battered by storm. And storms, I reminded myself, do not reward philosophers. They reward captains who are willing to throw cargo overboard to keep the ship afloat. I told myself sincerely that once the seas calmed, we would retrieve what was lost. But I began to sense a deeper truth, one that pressed against my certainty, even as I refused to name it. That calm, once achieved through fear, does not invite gentleness. It demands maintenance. And maintenance, when applied to morality, does not preserve virtue. It replaces it. Still, I stood firm, because to admit doubt now would mean admitting that the republic I had shaped was no longer a republic of citizens, but a republic of compliance. And I, who had once feared indulgence above all things, was now presiding over a nation where obedience had learned to call itself virtue. This was the republic of virtue, orderly, moral, efficient, and already, quietly, beginning to forget what it was meant to protect. I began to measure time differently, not by days, but by shifts in tone, a word omitted, a glance held too long, an invitation not extended. Power does not announce its withdrawal. It simply reallocates attention. I noticed how decisions were made before meetings began, how conclusions arrived already formed, awaiting only formal endorsement. My voice still carried weight, but no longer momentum. When I spoke of restraint, it sounded like delay. When I spoke of principle, it sounded like obstruction. I was being reclassified, not as an enemy, not yet, but as an inefficiency. That distinction mattered. Enemies are confronted, inefficiencies are removed. I reminded myself that revolutions consume symbols as readily as they create them. That visibility invites correction. I told myself this was merely another test, that fidelity to virtue would prevail. Once excess exhausted itself, but excess does not tire, it adapts. I watched men who once feared my judgment begin to speak around it. They no longer sought my approval, they sought my absence. Committees restructured subtly, responsibilities redistributed. Urgency invoked as justification, always urgency. Urgency is a powerful solvent. It dissolves accountability while preserving authority. I felt the ground shift beneath me, not suddenly, but steadily, as if the revolution were stepping forward and leaving me half a pace behind. I had spent my life believing that correctness would protect me, that alignment with principle was a shield against suspicion. I was wrong. Principle protects only when it is convenient. When it slows progress, it becomes suspect. I realized then that I was no longer feared for my severity. I was feared for my consistency. Consistency exposes opportunism, and opportunism, once empowered, does not tolerate mirrors. The irony was exact. I had built a system that punished hesitation. Now hesitation was being projected onto me. I had insisted that delay was betrayal. Now my insistence on coherence was framed as delay. I did not protest. Protest would have confirmed the charge. Instead, I observed, as I always had. But observation without authority is only awareness. And awareness, in times like these, is dangerous. I began to understand that survival was no longer guaranteed by virtue, by austerity, or by sacrifice. It would require something I had never cultivated: flexibility. That realization came too late, because flexibility, once absent, cannot be summoned under threat. It must be practiced in safety. And I had eliminated safety long before I needed it. The republic of virtue continued, efficient, relentless, unquestioning. It no longer spoke my name with reverence. It spoke it with calculation. I felt the revolution turn its gaze inward, seeking friction to eliminate. And for the first time, I did not ask, what must be done next? I asked something far more dangerous: whether the logic I had given life to would recognize its own creator as compatible with its future. The answer did not come in words. It came in silence. And silence, as I had learned in childhood, is never empty. It is preparatory. It waits. And soon, very soon, it would speak. The silence lengthened, not the kind that invites reflection, the kind that sharpens suspicion. I felt it in the way rooms rearrange themselves around me. Seats subtly reassigned, eyes no longer lifting when I entered, but lowering as if neutrality were now the safest posture. I had once believed fear flowed outward from authority. Now I understood it also flows inward. Authority listens. Every word I spoke was weighed not for meaning, but for implication, not what I said, but what it allowed others to do with it. That was new. I had trained men to hear consequences in language. Now they listened for weakness. I noticed how quickly severity could be repurposed, how easily moral urgency, once detached from its source, could justify anything, including removal of the man who taught it. I was not accused. Accusations are crude. I was anticipated. My speeches were quoted selectively, my cautions reframed as reluctance, my insistence on coherence presented as inflexibility. In a system that prized speed, inflexibility was indistinguishable from sabotage. I understood the logic immediately, and because I understood it, I could not refute it. To deny it would require me to deny the very principles I had elevated above all else. I told myself that if the revolution judged me, it would do so fairly, that my record would speak, that my sacrifices would be remembered. This was naive. Revolutions do not remember. They process. Memory slows them down. I had spent months arguing that individuals mattered less than outcomes. That consistency outweighed sentiment. That personal history was irrelevant when weighed against present necessity. Now, those principles stood upright and faced me. I did not panic. Panic is emotional, and I had disciplined emotion out of myself long ago. What I felt instead was a strange, narrowing clarity that the Republic of Virtue had reached the stage where it no longer distinguished between preservation and purification. And purification, once invoked, cannot tolerate exceptions, not even foundational ones. I reviewed my choices not with regret, but with precision. Each step followed logically, each escalation justified by the last. There were no aberrations, no betrayals of intent, only consequences. This realization did not absolve me, but it did steady me. If the Republic required my removal to maintain its momentum, then my resistance would be hypocrisy. I had taught that principle. Still, there was one thing I had not prepared for, that the system I built would not need to condemn me in order to neutralize me. It needed only to proceed, as if I were already irrelevant. And so it did. Decisions moved forward without my imprint. Declarations were issued without my cadence. Severity continued without my restraint. I watched, and for the first time, I could not intervene without contradicting myself. The logic was complete, perfect, and perfectly indifferent. I understood then that power does not end when authority is removed. It ends when meaning is reassigned. My meaning, once discipline, once certainty, once moral gravity, was being redistributed, diluted, normalized. The revolution no longer needed a conscience. It needed continuity. I had given it that. Now it was learning how to function without the inconvenience of reflection. I stood very still, as I had always done, because there are moments when movement only accelerates the inevitable, and I, who had built a life on standing firm, was finally forced to confront the one question my certainty had never allowed me to ask. When virtue becomes indistinguishable from obedience, what place remains for the man who defined it? The silence did not answer, but it tightened, and in that tightening I felt the shape of what was coming, not as fear, not as surprise, but as recognition. The revolution was not turning against me, it was simply doing exactly what I had taught it to do. I was summoned without ceremony. No accusation preceded it. No warning softened its arrival. Just a request. Formal, restrained, framed as necessity. That was how power spoke now. I walked through streets I no longer recognized. Not because they had changed, but because I had. The city moved around me with practiced neutrality. Life continued. Markets opened. Voices rose and fell. The revolution no longer needed my presence to justify itself. That knowledge followed me with every step. Inside the chamber, faces arranged themselves carefully, not hostile, not sympathetic, evaluative. I understood the posture immediately. This was not a trial. Trials are loud. This was calibration. I was asked to explain myself, not my actions, my tempo. Why the hesitation? Why the caution now? Why the insistence on coherence? When decisiveness was required, they spoke in the language I had taught them. I answered calmly, that virtue without restraint is not virtue. That discipline without reflection is brutality disguised as order. That a republic which forgets why it punishes will soon punish. Without knowing whom, I heard my own words fall into the room and fail to anchor. They were correct. They were precise. They were irrelevant. Relevance had shifted. I realized then that I was no longer being judged by the standards I had established. I was being measured against the momentum I had created, and by that measure I was slowing things down. They did not need to declare me an enemy. Enemies provoke resistance. They needed only to present me as an impediment. That framing was enough. I left the chamber unchanged in status, but altered in position. I felt it immediately. The distance had closed. What had once been evaluative silence was now preparatory. I returned home and sat alone, not to reflect, but to inventory. What remains to me? Conviction, still intact. Consistency, still demanded. Authority, conditional. Support, uncertain. I had believed that moral alignment would secure loyalty. But loyalty, I was learning, belongs to continuity, not to conscience. That night, I did not write speeches. I did not prepare arguments. I listened to the city, to its rhythm, to the absence of my own cadence within it. The revolution no longer echoed me. It moved faster now, lighter, unburdened by hesitation. I understood that my options had narrowed to a single paradox. If I resisted, I would validate the charge of obstruction. If I submitted, I would confirm my own dispensability. There was no third path. That realization did not anger me. It clarified me. I had spent my life insisting that individuals must yield to the needs of the Republic. Now the Republic was asking whether I was willing to obey my own doctrine. I did not know yet how this would end, but I knew something more important, that whatever followed would not be personal. It would be procedural, and procedure, once sanctified by virtue, does not feel guilt. It feels justified. I remained still, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that the final test of belief is not whether it changes the world, but whether it survives being applied to its creator. I waited, not because I believed waiting would save me, but because action now would have meant improvisation, and I had never trusted improvisation. The days that followed were strangely ordinary. No guards at my door, no summons delivered in haste, no public denunciation, just distance. Distance is how systems prepare themselves. It gives people time to adjust to absence, before absence becomes permanent. I noticed how my name was spoken less frequently, how discussions proceeded without reference to my position, how urgency no longer required my endorsement. This was not erasure, it was transition. I understood then that I was not being removed because I had failed. I was being removed because I had succeeded too completely. The logic no longer required explanation. The language no longer required its author. Virtue had been standardized, severity routinized, fear normalized. The machine was self-sustaining. I walked again through the city, slowly this time, and observed what my certainty had built. Order, yes. Stability of a kind, but also faces trained into stillness. Voices cautious even in agreement. A collective posture of endurance rather than hope. I asked myself too late, perhaps, whether this was what survival was meant to feel like. I did not answer. Answers were no longer my role. The summons came eventually, this time unmistakable. No rhetoric, no moral framing, just procedure. I was informed, not accused, that questions had arisen, that circumstances required clarification, that the safety of the Republic demanded thoroughness. Thoroughness. The word was immaculate. It carried no anger, no judgment, only inevitability. I felt no shock. Shock belongs to those who believe. They are exceptions. I had spent my life arguing against exceptions. As I prepared to leave, I noticed how little there was to take with me. No possessions of comfort, no letters of attachment, no indulgences to abandon, only ideas. And ideas, I knew, do not accompany a man into confinement. They remain outside, circulating, mutating, finding new voices. That knowledge hurt more than fear ever could, because it meant that whatever happened to me next would not slow the revolution, it would clarify it. I walked with measured steps, not because I wished to appear composed, but because composure was the last discipline, still under my control. As doors closed behind me, I did not feel betrayed. Betrayal implies trust. What I felt was completion. The logic had finished its work. I had believed that purity would protect the Republic. I had not considered that the Republic would eventually demand purity from me, and so I stood there, no longer the interpreter of virtue, no longer its custodian, but its subject, waiting to see whether a system built on necessity would recognize necessity when it stood before it in human form. I had no illusions, only one remaining question, quiet and exacting. When belief becomes structure, does it remember why it was believed? The answer was already forming, not in words, but in motion, and soon it would arrive. The cell was narrow, but orderly. That detail did not escape me. Even here, especially here, the Republic expressed itself through structure. Stone walls measured precisely, light entering at fixed hours, silence regulated by routine. This was not neglect, it was design. I sat, not as a man awaiting judgment, but as a variable being assessed. Time behaved differently, inside confinement, not slower, more deliberate. Each moment arrived complete, uninterrupted by urgency, unpressured by decision. For the first time in years, nothing required my approval. That absence felt unfamiliar, not relief. Exposure. I replayed nothing. I did not catalogue regrets. I did not rehearse defences. What would be the use? Every argument I could make had already been absorbed by the system. Every justification I could offer had already been refined and sharpened by others. I had trained them well. Outside, the Republic continued. With disciplined efficiency, committees met, orders were issued, names were processed. The machine did not hesitate, because one of its architects had stepped aside. That realization settled heavily. I had believed that my presence tempered severity, that without me, excess would accelerate. But excess had learned moderation's language. It no longer required its spirit. I listened to footsteps in the corridor and found myself cataloguing them by rhythm alone, purposeful, routine, indifferent. No malice, no haste. This, I understood, was the true nature of what I had built. Not rage, not chaos, but a calm that no longer distinguished between necessity and convenience. In that calm, there was no room for appeal. I considered briefly whether I should have acted differently, whether some earlier restraint might have altered the arc. The thought did not take hold, because even now I could trace every step. Each decision had followed logically. Each escalation answered a real threat. There were no arbitrary turns, only accumulation. I had not betrayed my principles. I had fulfilled them. That was the most unsettling truth of all. For if this outcome was faithful to what I believed, then the flaw was not in execution. It was in foundation. I had built morality as something that could be enforced without erosion. I had believed that virtue, once defined precisely enough, would resist corruption. I was wrong. Virtue, when stripped of mercy, does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes permission. I sat with that realization longer than I expected, not in anguish, in recognition. The Republic had not turned against me. It had simply reached a stage where my presence was no longer necessary to justify what it did. That was not injustice. It was efficiency. And efficiency, once elevated to moral principle, does not tolerate redundancy. Not even principled redundancy. I heard the distant hum of the city. Not unrest, not celebration, just continuation. History does not pause to acknowledge coherence. It moves forward, carrying what it can use and discarding what it cannot. I had taught it that lesson myself, and so I remained where I was, not pleading, not resisting, not retreating into martyrdom, only observing, as I always had, waiting not for mercy, but for the final demonstration of whether a system built to correct the world could still recognize the human cost of being correct. The answer, I sensed, would not be philosophical. It would be procedural, and it would arrive without raising its voice. The procedure arrived as expected, without drama, without announcement, without the courtesy of surprise. I was informed of the charges in language so refined it barely resembled accusation. Words like destabilization, obstruction, threat to unity, not crimes, conditions. I listened carefully. There was no venom in their voices, no triumph, only the careful cadence of men executing a task already agreed upon. They did not ask me to confess. Confession implies moral interest. They asked me to clarify. Clarification is administrative. I spoke when permitted, briefly, precisely. I did not renounce my principles. To do so would have been dishonest. And dishonesty, even now, felt beneath me. I stated calmly that virtue without restraint becomes indistinguishable from domination, that a republic which fears dissent has already abandoned confidence. That terror, once normalized, does not defend freedom. My words were recorded. They were not debated. Debate belongs to uncertainty. This was resolution. I understood then that I was not being silenced because I was wrong, but because I was complete. My argument had reached its endpoint. There was nothing left to extract from it. The revolution had absorbed my logic, streamlined it, and removed the element that complicated it, me. As the judgment concluded, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, not regret, relief. The burden of necessity, the constant demand to decide, to justify, to escalate, was no longer mine. For the first time since my youth, I was not responsible for the direction of history. That freedom arrived too late to be enjoyed, but not too late to be recognized. I was returned to confinement with the same procedural care with which I had been summoned. Nothing in their manner suggested cruelty. That, more than anything, confirmed the completeness of the transformation. Cruelty requires intent. This required only continuation. Alone again, I allowed myself a single dangerous thought, that perhaps a republic built on virtue requires something more fragile than discipline to survive, something I had never trusted, something I had never learned to protect. I thought of Aris, of silence, of certainty, of a boy who believed that the world could be corrected if one was strict enough. I wondered, not bitterly, not theatrically, whether that boy would recognize the man. Sitting here now, I did not answer. Answers no longer mattered. What mattered was sequence, and the sequence was clear. The revolution would proceed. The republic would endure, or collapse under the weight of its own rigor. And I would be remembered, not as a monster, nor as a savior, but as something far more unsettling, a man who was consistent, consistent enough to build a system that no longer required him. That was my legacy, not blood, not terror, but a structure that mistook correctness for wisdom and efficiency for justice. Soon, the final step would be taken. Not loudly, not cruelly, simply because the process had reached its conclusion, and I, who had always believed that history obeyed reason, would at last learn whether reason, when left alone, knows when to stop. The final notice did not shock me. Shock belongs to those who still believe. The events bend around expectation. This one did not. It arrived folded, measured, written in the same careful hand that once recorded my speeches. Date, hour, location, no adjectives, no judgment, only sequence. I read it once, then again, not to search for error, but to acknowledge completion. I had often said that justice must be swift. To be effective, that delay weakens resolve. That clarity requires decisiveness. Now those principles return to me. without alteration. I prepared myself, as I always had, not with prayer, not with appeal, but with order. I washed, I dressed, I refused consolation. Consolation implies that something unfair is occurring. I would not grant them that comfort. When they came for me, their manner was respectful. That, too, was fitting. The Republic did not hate me. It no longer needed to. We moved through corridors I had once crossed with authority. They felt narrower now, not physically, but symbolically. Power, once lost, reveals its architecture. Outside, the morning was clear, almost gentle. The city breathed, as it always had. Vendors arranging goods, voices overlapping, life continuing without interruption. This, I realized, was the final proof. The revolution no longer required spectacle. It required closure. I walked without resistance. Resistance would have suggested doubt, and doubt was the one luxury I had never permitted myself. As the crowd came into view, I did not search their faces. Crowds do not contain answers. They contain momentum. I had taught them that, too. There were murmurs, not rage, not celebration, recognition. I was no longer a man to them. I was a conclusion. At the final moment, standing where so many others had stood, I felt no surge of fear. Fear is emotional, and I had spent a lifetime training myself beyond it. What I felt instead was precision, the exact alignment of belief and consequence. I had believed that virtue, once defined clearly enough, could govern without mercy. I had believed that order was preferable to uncertainty. I had believed that the individual must yield to necessity. Now necessity stood before me and asked nothing more than consistency. I gave it. As my sight lifted to the open sky, wide, indifferent, unchanged by human systems, a final understanding settled, quiet and exact, that virtue without compassion does not prevent cruelty, it organizes it. That certainty, once elevated above doubt, does not protect justice. It replaces it, and that a man who builds a world on principles alone must be prepared to be judged by them without exception. There were no final words. None were needed. The Republic proceeded, and in that proceeding it revealed its final lesson, not about monsters or heroes, but about belief itself, that when morality becomes machinery, it will eventually require the silence of those who taught it how to move. The blade fell, not as vengeance, not as chaos, but as process. And in that moment, brief, absolute, and irrevocable, the Republic of Virtue proved its most unsettling truth, that it knew exactly what it was doing. There was no sound after, not to me. Sound belongs to bodies, and I no longer occupied one. If this is where stories usually end, it is only because language grows uncomfortable, when consequence outlives the man. But consequence does not stop. It spreads. I did not witness what followed, yet I understand it with a clarity I never possessed while alive. My death did not soften the Republic. It accelerated it. Those who removed me did not pause to reflect. Reflection implies uncertainty. They moved forward, armed with the certainty that if even I could be discarded, then no one need feel secure. That was the final refinement of the system. Fear, once justified by virtue, no longer required explanation. The Republic of Virtue survived me. Briefly, not because it was strong, but because momentum is stubborn. Then it collapsed, not under foreign invasion, not under royal restoration, but under the weight of its own immaculate logic. Because a system that cannot forgive cannot endure. It must always find something else to purify. I became a warning. Far too late to be preventative. Historians would later argue over my name. Monster, martyr, fanatic, idealist. They would miss the point. I was not extraordinary. That is the danger. I was precise, consistent, disciplined. I did not abandon morality. I completed it, stripped of mercy, stripped of doubt, stripped of the human frailty that interrupts certainty. And that is why this story matters. Not because I died, many died. Not because I killed, many killed. But because I believed with absolute sincerity that goodness could be enforced without becoming something else. I was wrong, not because virtue is weak, but because it is alive, and anything alive that is forced into stillness will eventually turn poisonous. If there is a lesson here, it is not political, it is human. Beware the man who never hesitates. Beware the voice that offers clarity without compassion. Beware the system that calls itself moral, but no longer asks, why? I was certain, and certainty, when left alone, does not save the world. It organizes its destruction and calls it order. This is where my story ends, not as a warning shouted, but as one offered quietly. Like silence, which I learned too late, is never empty. It is where everything begins. If you are still listening, then the story has done what it was meant to do, because the end of a life is not the end of its consequences. They linger in institutions, in habits of thought, in the reflex to trade uncertainty for control. Long after my name faded from banners, my logic remained. It appeared whenever fear demanded speed, whenever safety was invoked to silence hesitation, whenever morality was reduced to alignment. You can recognize it easily. It speaks in absolutes. It frames doubt as danger. It promises order without asking what must be erased to achieve it. I once believed that the greatest threat to justice was corruption. I was wrong. The greater threat is righteousness that refuses to be questioned because corruption knows it is flawed. Righteousness believes it is complete, and completeness is hostile to life. If I could speak again, not as a judge, not as a martyr, but as a man finally stripped of authority, I would say this: do not trust systems that work too well. Do not admire leaders who never pause. Do not confuse discipline with wisdom. Ask where mercy has gone. Ask who benefits from urgency. Ask why silence feels safer than speech. These questions slow things down. That is their virtue. I once believed that slowing was weakness. Now I understand. It is how humanity breathes. My life was not a tragedy because it ended violently. It was a tragedy because it ended logically. Everything followed. Nothing interrupted. And that, more than terror, more than blood, more than ideology, is the true danger. Not evil that rages, but belief that never hesitates. If this story leaves you uneasy, then it has done its work. Unease is the beginning of conscience. And conscience, unlike virtue enforced, still knows how to listen. This is where I remain, not in history, not in judgment, but in the quiet space between certainty and doubt, where the most important decisions are still allowed to hesitate. And if you carry anything forward From this long walk through conviction, let it be this: never build a world that has no place for forgiveness. Because when forgiveness disappears, virtue does not become stronger. It becomes efficient, and efficiency, when given moral authority, will one day ask for everything before the blade, before the name becomes history. I am often remembered as certainty, as severity, as a mind without softness. But certainty is not born whole. It is grown, slowly, from fear of chaos, from hunger for order, from a quiet terror of being wrong, in a world already falling apart. I did not wake up one morning and choose this path. I walked it step by step, each decision small enough to feel reasonable, each sacrifice framed as temporary, each loss justified by what might be saved. I told myself that mercy could wait, that compassion would return once the danger had passed. I did not see that danger feeds on postponement, that when mercy is delayed, it does not wait patiently, it disappears. I believed I was protecting the people from cruelty. I did not notice when I began protecting the system from the people, and that is the quiet tragedy. No scaffold can show, not the fall, not the blood, but the moment a man stops asking who his certainty is costing. If you had asked me then whether I was afraid, I would have said no. But now I understand. I was afraid of one thing only, that without discipline the world would collapse. So I built something that could not bend, and anything that cannot bend will eventually break, or break others. I was not cruel. I was consistent. And consistency, when left alone, is colder than hatred. This is where I leave you for now. Not at my death, not at the blade, but at the moment just before, at the point where belief has finished becoming law, and law has forgotten how to listen. In the next chapter, you will not hear my voice as clearly. You will hear others, those who feared me, those who replaced me, those who learned from my certainty without carrying its burden. You will see what happens when a revolution outlives its conscience. For now, sit with this question. At what point does doing what feels necessary become doing what feels inevitable? And when that moment arrives, who is still allowed to say stop? If you are listening in the quiet of the night, tell me, where are you in the world right now? And will you stay with me as the revolution turns on itself? There was no sound after, not to me. Sound belongs to bodies, and I no longer occupied one. If this is where stories usually end, it is only because language grows uncomfortable, when consequence outlives the man. But consequence does not stop. It spreads. I did not witness what followed, yet I understand it with a clarity I never possessed while alive. My death did not soften the Republic. It accelerated it. Those who removed me did not pause to reflect. Reflection implies uncertainty. They moved forward, armed with the certainty that if even I could be discarded, then no one need feel secure. That was the final refinement of the system. Fear, once justified by virtue, no longer required explanation. The Republic of Virtue survived me. Briefly, not because it was strong, but because momentum is stubborn. Then it collapsed. Not under foreign invasion, not under royal restoration, but under the weight of its own immaculate logic. Because a system that cannot forgive cannot endure. It must always find something else to purify. I became a warning. Far too late to be preventative. Historians would later argue over my name. Monster, martyr, fanatic, idealist. They would miss the point. I was not extraordinary. That is the danger. I was precise, consistent, disciplined. I did not abandon morality. I completed it, stripped of mercy, stripped of doubt, stripped of the human frailty that interrupts certainty. And that is why this story matters. Not because I died, many died. Not because I killed, many killed. But because I believed, with absolute sincerity, that goodness could be enforced without becoming something else. I was wrong, not because virtue is weak, but because it is alive. And anything alive that is forced into stillness will eventually turn poisonous. If there is a lesson here, it is not political, it is human. Beware the man who never hesitates. Beware the voice that offers clarity without compassion. Beware the system that calls itself moral, but no longer asks, why? I was certain, and certainty, when left alone, does not save the world. It organizes its destruction and calls it order. This is where my story ends, not as a warning shouted, but as one offered quietly, like silence, which I learned too late, is never empty. It is where everything begins. If you are still listening, then the story has done what it was meant to do, because the end of a life is not the end of its consequences. They linger in institutions, in habits of thought, in the reflex to trade uncertainty for control. Long after my name faded from banners, my logic remained. It appeared whenever fear demanded speed, whenever safety was invoked to silence hesitation, whenever morality was reduced to alignment. You can recognize it easily. It speaks in absolutes. It frames doubt as danger. It promises order without asking what must be erased to achieve it. I once believed that the greatest threat to justice was corruption. I was wrong. The greater threat is righteousness that refuses to be questioned because corruption knows it is flawed. Righteousness believes it is complete, and completeness is hostile to life. If I could speak again, not as a judge, not as a martyr, but as a man finally stripped of authority, I would say this: do not trust systems that work too well. Do not admire leaders who never pause. Do not confuse discipline with wisdom. Ask where mercy has gone. Ask who benefits from urgency. Ask why silence feels safer than speech. These questions slow things down. That is their virtue. I once believed that slowing was weakness. Now I understand. It is how humanity breathes. My life was not a tragedy because it ended violently. It was a tragedy because it ended logically. Everything followed. Nothing interrupted. And that, more than terror, more than blood, more than ideology, is the true danger. Not evil that rages, but belief that never hesitates. If this story leaves you uneasy, then it has done its work. Unease is the beginning of conscience. And conscience, unlike virtue enforced, still knows how to listen. This is where I remain, not in history, not in judgment, but in the quiet space between certainty and doubt, where the most important decisions are still allowed to hesitate. And if you carry anything forward from this long walk through conviction, let it be this: never build a world that has no place for forgiveness. Because when forgiveness disappears, virtue does not become stronger. It becomes efficient, and efficiency, when given moral authority, will one day ask for everything before the blade, before the name becomes history. I am often remembered as certainty, as severity as a mind without softness. But certainty is not born whole. It is grown, slowly, from fear of chaos, from hunger for order, from a quiet terror of being wrong, in a world already falling apart. I did not wake up one morning and choose this path. I walked it step by step, each decision small enough to feel reasonable, each sacrifice framed as temporary, each loss justified by what might be saved. I told myself that mercy could wait, that compassion would return once the danger had passed. I did not see that danger feeds on postponement, that when mercy is delayed, it does not wait patiently, it disappears. I believed I was protecting the people from cruelty. I did not notice when I began protecting the system from the people, and that is the quiet tragedy. No scaffold can show, not the fall, not the blood, but the moment a man stops asking who his certainty is costing. If you had asked me then whether I was afraid, I would have said no. But now I understand. I was afraid of one thing only, that without discipline the world would collapse. So I built something that could not bend, and anything that cannot bend will eventually break, or break others. I was not cruel. I was consistent. And consistency, when left alone, is colder than hatred. This is where I leave you for now. Not at my death, not at the blade, but at the moment just before, at the point where belief has finished becoming law, and law has forgotten how to listen. In the next chapter, you will not hear my voice as clearly. You will hear others, those who feared me, those who replaced me, those who learned from my certainty without carrying its burden. You will see what happens when a revolution outlives its conscience. For now, sit with this question. At what point does doing what feels necessary become doing what feels inevitable? And when that moment arrives, who is still allowed to say stop? If you are listening in the quiet of the night, tell me, where are you in the world right now? And will you stay with me as the revolution turns on itself?